challenging scholarship number 12, and this time on Numbers. Not the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, but the way Numbers are used in the books of the New Testament to establish their structure, particularly in the messages from the writer to the reader, so that they can represent the work of the writer in the way that he intended. Numbers. I was at a New Testament conference, the British New Testament annual conference of the Society, and a New Testament professor said to me, "You're the one who's interested in numbers, aren't you?" Now, she had written on Mark. I suggested to her, well, Mark's interested in numbers. And I thought perhaps she was referring to my work, my PhD on the Markan matrix. Yes, I did tackle numbers there. I've tackled numbers in a number of books now, since those days, in the 90s, through the first 2 decades of this year. And you can find what we're looking at now in my New Testament Illustrated Exhibition edition, edition 5. I first started producing this in 2003. The latest edition is to be found on my 2 websites, davidgpalmer.co.uk and New Testament, New Testimony. So updates, but I've got a page here out of this book, and other pages will follow. And we're going to be looking therefore at the way in which numbers play their part in the texts of the New Testament books. The place to start is with Homer's Iliad. New Testament scholars haven't been interested in numbers over the years, mention numbers and perhaps about their meaning, and you'll get some very strange looks. In our age, we don't see the significance of numbers in the way that first century folk did. 7 centuries before Christ, Homer was writing. It mattered to him that he had balance from the beginning to the end of his presentation in 24 books as we have them today. But his prologue, he has a series of days, 1, 9, 1, 12, which he replicates, that's out of line, isn't it? In the epilogue, instead of 1, 9, 1, 12, it's 12, 1, 9, 1, opposites to each other. This is intentional, structuring the text of his great epic. He then applies the principles of complication, turning point and denouement, which became then an accepted way of writing. Days 1, 2 and 3 in the complication. Turning point, envoys are sent to Achilles to wake him up and stir him up and tell him to come and assist. And a completion in the denouement, days 1, 2 and 3. How can we read this? Because day 1 beginning with night, Zeus could not sleep. And day 1 after the turning point, beginning with night, Agamemnon could not sleep. Day 2, beginning with Zeus and Hera. Day 2, beginning with Zeus and Hera. Day 3, beginning with dawn spreading her saffron robe. Day 3, beginning with dawn in her saffron robe. You can see it's an A, B, B prime, X, A, B, B prime structure and sequence to the parts that make up the whole of the narrative, bordered by the prologue and the epilogue. we've seen already how Mark uses this, Matthew uses it, and others are using exactly this Homeric style of writing. But Numbers, I'm just pointing out, are so important to him describing his parts that make up the whole, the sequence of those parts, the way they work together. I think we could move on. There are other details which show that it's more than just a simple, straightforward sequence, but there are relationships to be made between the outer and the inner pieces towards the centre, so that we have a meeting between Menelaus and Paris and a meeting between Hector and Achilles, significant meetings. The arming of Paris, the arming of Patroclus, and the battle wavers to and fro, how the battle turned. Symmetry. Homer is establishing the principle of the following of symmetry in the writing of any epic. So when the Gospel writers got to writing, they viewed their works, Mark in the first instance, as a drama, but as an epic. When I said to my professor, who said, you're the one that's interested in numbers, aren't you? I referred him to chapter 8, verse 21. Do you still not understand? Jesus says to the disciples in the boat, haven't you understood? They've got in the boat with only one loaf between them. They've fed 5,000, and so he says, don't you remember after we fed 5,000 with 5 loaves, how many basketfuls of bits leftovers did you pick up? And they said, 12. And when we fed the 4,000 with 7 loaves, how many basketfuls did we collect of pieces left over? And they said 7. And almost painfully he says, do you still not understand? He's just quoted an Isaianic passage to them. Have you ears and not hear? Have you eyes and not see? Something of an exasperation is being expressed as he wants them to understand these numbers. Well, you can see how these lie opposite each other, the feedings of the 5 and the 4, in this series B, Days of Increase. And it all rotates on the episode of the Syrophoenician woman who begs help for her daughter and says that even the children, even the dogs are willing to pick up the pieces from under the children's table. We are here seeing the significance of numbers expressed as Jesus' ministry goes from Jew to Gentile, or from including the Jew to including also the Gentile. And the meaning of this issue and presentation is surely that God has provided richly for everyone, for Jew and Gentile. There's loads left over. We could see it for ourselves in nature. There's more abundance than ever nature can cope with. We've got tadpoles at the moment, yes, lots of them, developing their little lives. Some will turn out to be froglets, and then frogs in turn, fine. But here we go. 5,005 is a number that expresses the Old Covenant people because of the 5 books of the law, the 5 books of the Psalms. 4,004 was thought of as the winds, so the compass points for us today, north, south, east and west, universality, the nations of the world. And 4 times 7 is the scheme, 4 series of 7 days in which the writer gives us the epic, the narrative between his prologue and his epilogue. You want to follow my arguments for the epilogue, you have to turn to Mark and Matrix, or an up-to-date version of the Mark and Matrix, the Gospel of Mark, chapter and verse, and that only came out during lockdown. 4 series of 7 days, 4 times 7. That will have expressed meaning in the first century. Universal salvation will have been expressed through that actual systematizing of the days, telling the story of Jesus from the beginning on a Sabbath. And the Sabbath comes to an end in this 24-hour period because the day begins with the dawn. But the Sabbath, the sun sets. It's the only reference to a sun setting in the whole of the Gospel. And on the last day, if this is the old Sabbath, this is the sun rising on the last day. And all this side of the equation, because an equation it is the new covenant being established by Jesus. And all this side is Jesus completing the old covenant. So numbers have their purpose. Is there in the text any more numbers to be had? The balances here, there and everywhere. There's 2,000 pigs died. Legion representing the number of soldiers maybe in a legion. This is the exorcism of the naked man who troubled everybody in that area, and then Jesus became the substitute trouble. It reads here that opposite it, as Jesus dies, he does battle with the evil forces of this world. 12 years of age, 12 are chosen on the first day of this establishing of the new covenant. 12 are chosen from a massive crowd, a crowd of 7 crowds, and that has to be symbolic. That 7 represents completion, fulfillment, everything come to its whole. 12, because of 12 tribes, particularly the forming of old Israel. Now 12 disciples are helping Jesus form new Israel. So numbers in the text, in these 3 days in the telling, they begin with 12 being chosen and the 12 being equipped. And on the last day of these 3, a 12-year-old hemorrhage is stopped, and a 12-year-old child is raised from her bed and death, just as Simon Peter's mother-in-law is raised from her bed on the first day of that series of 7 days. So Homerically, we've got balances again going through the text. So it's also A, B, B prime, 3 days, turning point day, 3 days. But as with Homer and the Iliad, it's also well balanced. I've only just recently seen how we've got a powerful connection here between the first day and the last day, but also between this day and this day, because I think it can be said that the only times that the crowd is walking with Jesus and making progress down the road together, crowd and Jesus on the road, and here he enters Jerusalem. Before we move on, as I think a further argument for the inclusion of this epilogue, which is not the whole of the longer ending by any means, verses 17 and 18 and 20b have to be expunged, it seems to me, because they have their look of being added much later. This looks like it had been expunged for a time, but got reinstated with the longer piece of the additional verses. But establishing the end would give us a 7 here, Mary Magdalene, from whom Jesus exorcised 7 demons, and up here his calling of 2 sets of brothers in a three-part prologue. The prologue ends with that his work has begun, John is imprisoned, Jesus declares the good news, he goes, calls two, a little bit further down the shore line of the Sea of Galilee, he calls two more. It's 2 plus 2 and 7. And I put it to you that the writer includes these as a reading check for his reader. In other words, there are there's 2 outer series and 2 inner series. Brothers, if you like, in the witness to Jesus. So 2 twos and 7 days. So it's as though the writer has built these in for the reader to read the text in the way that he wants. We'll come back to that as we look at Matthew. Written surely after Mark, and immediately we notice it works with numbers, sections 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, C, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. On this principle, okay, of the old menorah, but increased from 7 to 11 sections. So the numbering is important for the reader to pick up what the writer is saying. But if we look at the opening and closing pieces, here is a reading check for the reader, that they'll know, he or she maybe, will know what the writer intends in the way of the presentation. It opens with the birth relatives of Jesus, I call it, the ancestry, the genealogy, and it's 3 times 14 names, and we know names have been dropped. We can see from the Old Testament that the names of 3 kings have been removed and one has been repeated to make this 3 times 14. But it's saying more to the reader than anybody would have expected, I think, throughout the centuries. Look out for 14s. All the sections are made up of 14 units each, with the 2 exceptions of these that lie opposite each other, the teachings of Jesus on the Mount, the blessings, and the teachings of Jesus in the temple, the woes, in the temple and outside of the temple. 3 14s of pieces. So there's more being said in the opening piece than most people would have ever thought. And the final scene tells us what? Jesus meets with the 11 disciples for their commissioning. So in the very final scene, we have the number 11 for the very first time in the whole of the text. And that seems to me to be put there, or because it is there, it helps the reader understand that they too have found 11 sections, 5 to the centre of the parables of the kingdom of heaven and 5 from it. So a reading check, beginning and ending of the whole of this text. Clearly the balances here that we find in Mark, the feeding of the 5,000 sits in the middle of a 7-unit whole, and the feeding of the 4,000 sits in the middle of the attending 7-unit whole. So balances are being made across the text. We pointed these out in an earlier session, and across the text this way, 2 blind men calling son of David, or here Pharisees ask for a sign, Jonah only. Pharisees ask for a sign, Jonah only will be given them. So again, it's as with Homer's work, reliant on numbers, but communicating numbers, as with Mark also, so with Homer to a degree in that sense. we're not talking about days here but units. In our next two sessions we'll look at how the units are determined by syntax and grammar, simply by parsing the text. But we'll carry on with numbers. I'm going to worry that I've missed something that I should include, but as with Matthew, so with Luke we have 5 sections to the central section and 5 balancing sections. I've colour-coded them. And I've used a palette of universal colours here, I think, to express both Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. Supremely we have 5C5, and in the Catechism in the middle, 5 sections, a central section and mirroring 5 sections, all mirroring each other for theme and contents throughout. It's when we get to the final section we twice come across the number 11. In this opening A part, 11 is mentioned. 11 is mentioned in the first of the 2 B parts, so not in the third, but here Jesus points the 2 on the Emmaus Road to the fulfilling of the Scriptures, and here the 11 and others to the fulfilling of the Scriptures. But that the number 11 is used in this section only tells me that the writer intends to communicate to the reader, this is my 11th section, have you got it? With Luke, this Gospel for the Gentiles, it's more about balances and symmetry than it is with Matthew. Matthew's Gospel is written that way for Jews, and were they more acquainted with that kind of writing? It may be, but for the Gentile world this was most certainly prepared, because what is very much at the heart of on which everything revolves is Jesus' willingness to die in Jerusalem, and in fulfilment of both Roman law and Old Testament law, Old Covenant law. That is a theme. The law's demands are met, and the law and the prophets are fulfilled in Jesus' ministry. So, moving on. In the Acts, we find another 11-section presentation with 5 sections, a central section and 5, and these parallel Luke's Gospel to the extent that we can see that the message is that Jesus lives again in the life of his church. It is brought to birth in the Spirit and sustained by the Spirit through every kind of challenge and testing. What we find is again, as with Luke, less emphasis on numbers for the structure. Once it's established, it's the reader who's got the responsibility. The way we can tell, there are helps in the text, repetition, so that the people turn to the Lord. That's early in the text from 9:32, and at the last they turn to the Lord. And those are the only uses of that phrase. This is Phrygia and Galatia. Phrygia and Galatia. Galatia and Phrygia. Words turned round. We see the correspondence. That's so often done. A reverse way of looking, like Homer's prologue and epilogue, where one set of days is the reverse of the other. But a new thing tends to show itself. In the opening section we have 120 present, and added to the 11. So Matthias is added to the 11, but it doesn't say so makes 12 again. The implication is that. But 11 is mentioned in the opening section here. So the reciter is given the help, perhaps at the end of the opening section, to look for 11 sections. Again, the birth of Jesus in Luke's Gospel is comparative to the birth of the church's mission, and the concluding 3,000 people making their response. So we've got 120, 3,000. We've got in the, well, with the opening speech of Peter and the response of the crowd that leads to 3,000 being baptised that day, Peter preaches all can be saved, and 3,000 are. Paul says on the sea journey, he fears that we're not going to get through this without a loss of life. But in the end, no, 276 souls are saved. All of them, no one is lost. And that's a phrase that also comes up in John's Gospel. Twice over, Jesus lost no one of his disciples. But we've got a different kind of number here. It's used for emphasis, and they are triangular. 120 is the sum of 1 to 15. 276, I think, is the sum of 1 to 23. Triangular numbers have their importance, as we will see in John's Gospel and the Revelation. But here we find use of them in Luke. I'm on the edge here. I'm not sure if Luke was the first to use them, or as this was being completed, John's Gospel came to light, maybe, I don't know. There's a lot of supposing to be done, but at least we have these. So they represent approximate numbers, but significant numbers. So it's both approximate and significant. 120 were present praying for the 10 days that followed the ascension of Jesus to that day that they received the Spirit, which we commemorated in the church yesterday for Pentecost Sunday. It's in the meanings of the text that we find the strength of the writer more than anything. And I think this is more, we see it today much more as a theological text than a historical one, one that can be relied upon for the dating of Paul's letters, say. If you count the units up, it's 50, exactly 50 to the middle, and then 50 to the end. 100 units make up this whole text, and this story where the 276 are saved leaves only 2, 4, 6, 8 parts of the whole 100 texts to go. But every text is made up of A, B, B prime, 3-part writing style, or A, B, A if it's a central piece. That's said quickly, but next time we get together you'll see a bit more about this as we look around the whole of the New Testament's texts. But if we multiply these by 3 for the parts that make them up, then we have 24 parts. If you add those to the 276, you have 300. You ask yourself, is that a writing check? That number is a significant number in anybody's book. The sum of 1 to 23, if I'm right with that, check it for yourselves. But it's indicative to the reader that he's actually got to the right place at the right moment, and that the whole is completed in its 300th piece, or it's in its 100th part, than if each part is made up of 3 pieces. John again, we have sections, and this time it's the menorah, but just the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the middle branches of this menorah that follow through. Jesus comes on scene as the Lamb of God and leaves sacrificed, slain at the same time that the Passover lambs are being slaughtered. And that's the reason for this writer changing the date of Jesus' death, because this is a powerful symbolic meaning. Jesus, and it comes again in the next book, the Revelation, that we're looking at. Numbers, particularly in the way that we have the first sign, the 6 jars of water for the cleansing of the Jews, and Jesus translates that water into wine. It's the first of the signs. It's in unit 6 of the text, or we can multiply these by 3, and that would be between what's that, 16, 17, 18 parts. The next sign we get is in the 12th part. So they occupy similar positions. This is the first half. This is the parallel second half to completing the whole in 7 times 12. So this has to be important, that there are 84 units to John's Gospel, using the numbers of 7 and 12. 12, the number that expresses God having his will and way with us. 7, his plans coming to full fruition, to completion. And as we come through the first section to the second, we find there's another number in the text, and it's 38. The 38 years that a man was prevented, or his needs for healing were not met as he stood by a pool or crouched by the pool. The water had bubbled but gone, the bubbling had gone before he could get in. Well, Jesus heals him, and this number 38 corresponds to the peace of the text. So we've got 36 pieces to the opening text if we multiply 12 by 3. And the 37th is the introductory part, the 38th tells us of the healing and how old the man is, or how long he's been trying to get healed, 38 years. The next time we get a significant number is in the penultimate frame, and it's the 83rd unit, and that figure is 153. And this has long been known as a triangular number. The big fish, a catch of big fish, it has to be meaningful. Say everybody who's ever read the text, but nobody's agreed over what it means. They talk about species of fish in the sea, never understanding, but it's a significant number. Everybody's been able to say that, and that it's the sum of 1 to 17. Yeah, that makes it significant too, say people. But when you put it in the context, this number 153, in the setting of the 83rd part, you can see by simple arithmetic that 83 is 3, 8, 8 is 38 reversed, 3, 8, and symmetry does that in the text of Homer, in his prologue and epilogue. You turn things backwards way round, you get your 83rd part. Associated, is it? Is it associated like the 6 jars with the 6th unit, the 38th year with the 38th piece? If it is associated, then we have a leftover figure of 70, and that we know is the word that expresses Gentile, or the nations. We need to flip back to Matthew, or can we manage without? To see that there are 70 units here, 70 here and 70 here, in the three major parts of this gospel. Jesus is born to be king, calls disciples. 5 times 14, 70 parts. Kingdom building, Jesus equips and prepares his disciples in 5 series of 14 parts. That's 70 parts. Becoming king, he sends out his disciples. Through his death and resurrection, and even on the cross, he's there as King of the Jews and dies King of the Jews. Now, in 5 times 14 units, 70 parts, it comes to its conclusion. 3 times over, Matthew's Gospel is telling us and telling Jews that the Gospel is for the nations of the world. It's not just for them. It is for them, but it is for all nations, all peoples. And that's where those feeding miracles come in Mark, I think, and also have their place in Matthew, but he doesn't use them quite so strongly as indeed Mark does. With the final 6th book of the New Testament, when we're just focusing on books and structure and numbers, we have the clearest evidence. Bockham has said that this is the most extraordinarily complex arrangement of any book in the New Testament. Well, I think I do beg to differ. It may look like that to you today if you're looking at this for the first time, but a menorah, again I'll hold this up, a 7-branched lampstand is used, and Jesus is seen to be standing amongst 7 lampstands. The first letter to the Ephesian church says, if you don't return to your former love, I'll come and take the lampstand from your midst. And the lampstand is the church. But what wonderfully in 7 sevens, and by this arrangement, this writer is saying, if John's Gospel is saying that the lamp stands for the life and light of God in the world, this is what rabbis teach of that lampstand that stood by the table of the bread of the presence in the tabernacle and then subsequently in the temple, and I think 7 of them in Solomon's version. Here, well, as in John's Gospel, Jesus is the life and light of God in the world. Now this writer is saying, the church, you are the life and light of God in Christ Jesus in the world. You're presencing what Jesus has begun, and you're witnessing what comes to its fruition and fulfillment. So 7 sevens, perfect conclusion. This is encouragement for the church that God's plan will come eventually to its fullest conclusion. Within his will, evil will be destroyed, and the good in which we've all had a part to play will be established in eternity. Numbers, of course, appear here, big numbers, significant numbers like 144,000, and significant numbers occur in the middle of this text. The big one, of course, is 666, and that is a triangular number. I don't think many have seen it as that. They've quickly gone to Nero, Emperor Nero, for an interpretation, which I could see why we should, because at the heart of this gospel, God is dealing with the things that people of the church have no power over. He is responsible for the big things, dealing with the devil and the Antichrist. Our job is much easier, righteous living, but we know as we say that, that's enough for us to cope with. So we leave the rest to God. It really is a comfort, and visions are given, and worship is springing from many of its pieces. It is a a book for today, maybe, as we come out of lockdown and return to life as we want it to be, which hopefully will be different from what it was. But we have opportunities galore as we come out of our homes, our holes, and re-engage. So is this a day when the church, it needs to know what its books are about? They're not so much, they are about historical roots, but they're not so much about histories as stories that tell us eternal truth. And that makes these texts even more valuable to my way of thinking than the way we pretended in all their differences when they can't, like for instance with the dating of the crucifixion. If John can change the date so simply, but to make a bigger point that Jesus is that Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world as he comes on the stage, as he leaves it, he is the Lamb of God taking away the sin of the world. These are big books in their big statements, and we mustn't belittle what they are about. Sevens, it seems to be as a simple representation. Numbers like this, 666, fascinating, interesting, important. Yeah, I think all the three sections here are telling us about the fall of Jerusalem and how life was changed for so many. The first resurrection, I think, is more to do with AD 70 than anything else. And what's still to come is pretty much the final few frames. This is all encouragement to see that God will bring to its completion what he's planned. That's Numbers. Not the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, but the way in which Numbers are used in the texts of New Testament faith. And for that reason I think it's an exposition that we all need to awaken to. I hope you've enjoyed this and you'll join me for the next session. Next two sessions will be on reading the texts and taking them out of pages of my book. You can get all of these on the websites, as I mentioned earlier, or in that book, New Testament, to the skills of the writers and first readers. Thank you.